Hey everyone, Chuck from Chuckwagon MTG here. Thanks for checking out another one of our videos. Today we're bringing you a deck tech for Monument to Humanity. Now the deck we're bringing you today is kind of an adaptation of the popular standard deck that's going on right now, the White-Blue Monument. Now this deck can quickly fill the field just like its counterpart, but it can kind of do it with slightly bigger creatures and, I believe, more solid board presence. Plus, the time this video was created, the deck is only about $195 TCG mid, so it's actually on the cheaper end of standard, as sad as that is. So let's go ahead and dive into this new addition to Standard Tribal. We'll go ahead and start off with our low-end creatures, which actually make up the majority of the deck. We have 4 copies of both Expedition Envoy and Thraben Inspector. Now, Expedition Envoy is a great value 2-1 for just a white mana, while the Thraben Inspector is a 1-2 for just 1 white mana, but it also brings in a clue into the battlefield when it enters. Next, we have 4 copies of Thalia's Lieutenant and 2 copies of Hanweir Militia Captain. Now, all these have great synergy, being that they're humans. The Lieutenant will put a +1/+1 counter on all of them when it enters the battlefield, and then they will also trigger the second ability and put a +1/+1 counter on the Lieutenant when they end up entering the battlefield. And once the Militia Captain flips by having 4 more creatures on the battlefield at your upkeep, every one of your end steps, it will create a 1/1 black and white human that will then also trigger the Lieutenant again for another +1/+1 counter. Next, we have 3 copies of Selfless Spirit. It's a 2-1 spirit that can fly in for a little damage, but they're mainly there to protect our board by sacrificing it and giving our other creatures indestructible. Also, we're running 4 copies of Glory-Bound Initiate, a 3-1 for 2 that can be exerted when it attacks to give it +1/+3 and lifelink until end of turn. Now, he's a human, so he's going to trigger the Lieutenant, but we're also running 2 copies of Always Watching, which makes him a 4-2, and he becomes a 5-5 with lifelink when he attacks. And with Always Watching, he gets to exert every turn without the penalty of not untapping at your next upkeep. Now, that just sounds pretty good to me. Next, we have 2 copies of Archangel, a 4/4 flyer for 5 that has Flash and Vigilance that grants all of your creatures indestructible until end of the turn in which she comes into the battlefield. When a non-angel creature you control dies, she transforms at the beginning of the next upkeep into a 6/5 flyer. When it transforms, it deals 3 damage to each other creature and each opponent. Both sides have great interactions with Selfless Spirit, as you can sacrifice the Selfless Spirit to transform Avacyn on the next upkeep, or you can sack it in response to Avacyn transforming to protect your human army from the 3 damage that happens when it flips. Our last creature is not a human, but it can be. We have 4 copies of Metallic Mimic. It's a 2-1 artifact creature for 2 that when it enters the battlefield, you choose a creature type. It becomes that creature type as well as its others, and gives all creatures of that type a +1/+1 counter when they enter the battlefield. This is great for all the humans in this deck and turns the 1/1 white-black human tokens generated by Militia Captain into 2/2s. But its uses don't stop there. We're also running 4 copies of Oketra's Monument. All white creatures cost 1 less mana to cast, so the majority of the creatures in our deck now drop down to 1 mana. Also, whenever you cast a creature, it creates a 1/1 white warrior token as well. So back to our Metallic Mimic, if we were to name warrior instead of human, then the Monument will put out a 2/2 token every time we cast a creature. If this can be done early game, it's going to put a lot of pressure on your opponent, and basically it's just an excellent multi-purpose tool. Our next non-creature spell is 2 copies of Dusk Dawn. Dusk is a sorcery that has a cost of 4 mana, and it destroys all creatures with power 3 or greater. Now this deck is be putting out plenty of 1/1 and 2/2 tokens, as well as our other little 1 and 2 power guys, so even if we do lose some of our pumped creatures, the opponent's probably going to be losing more. And don't forget that we also have 3 copies of Selfless Spirit in this deck, so we can always just sacrifice if we happen to have our bigger guys out. That way it only wipes out their side of the board and not ours. The card's Aftermath effect, Dawn, is insanely good and brings back all creatures in our graveyard with power 2 or less back to our hand, which is pretty much everything aside from the Glorybound Initiate and the Archangel Avacyn. The turn after you play it, you can essentially just recast most of your hand and flood the battlefield all over again. Lastly, we have 3 copies of Fatal Push, which destroys a target creature with converted mana cost of 2 or less. With Revolt, meaning that a permanent you controlled left the battlefield this turn, it can target a creature with converted mana cost of 4 or less. This could be just enough to slow down those aggro decks that we see popping up everywhere right now. For our lands, we're going to be running 10 plains. We're running 4 Concealed Courtyards, so we can have that black mana for our Fatal Push. And then we're also running 4 Shambling Vents. Now, it enters the battlefield tapped, but it does produce both a black and a white, and it can be used, activated, to be turned into a 2/3 white and black elemental creature with lifelink until end of turn. Now, with Always Watching and whatnot, that could actually get pretty good. We also have 2 copies of Shafet Dunes. Now, this is one of the new desert lands, and essentially it creates a generic mana. You can pay 1 life and tap it to create a white mana, but the big thing we're going to be looking at here is the bottom part of the card, which is 2 and 2 white. Tap it, you sacrifice a desert, and creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. You can only activate this at the time you could a sorcery, but it's just one last thing to, I guess, kind of over the edge. You need to get through that last couple points of damage. This is going to be the card to help you do that. And then lastly, we have 2 copies of Westvale Abbey. It taps to produce a generic mana. You can pay 5, tap it, pay 1 life, and you put a 1/1 white and black human cleric creature token onto the battlefield. And once again, that has the interactions with the militia captain and the lieutenant. But then you can also pay 5, tap it, sacrifice 5 creatures, and you get to transform Westvale Abbey, and then you get to untap it. Now, we're going to be producing enough creatures and tokens in this where flipping it shouldn't be that big of a deal. This is kind of another finishing aspect here. Now, when you flip it, it turns into Ormondal, Profane Prince, which is a legendary creature demon, a 9/7 flying lifelink, indestructible, hasty creature that is, unless they can deal with it immediately, it's pretty much game over. I mean, the fact that it's 9 damage is big, but the fact that it's lifelink, so you're actually looking at an 18-point swing, that's exceptionally hard to come back from. Our sideboard consists of 2 Ether Sphere Harvesters that aggro's going to have kind of a hard time dealing with because of their low crewing cost, its high toughness, and its ability to gain lifelink by simply paying 1 energy, and it comes into the battlefield. It brings 2 with it. So, Ether Sphere Harvester is a pretty solid sideboard card, especially in aggro. We also have 2 Angel of Sanctions, a 5-drop, 3/4 flyer that exiles target non-land permanent that an opponent controls until Angel of Sanctions leaves the battlefield. And with it having Embalm, this guy can really come in handy late game. For extra removal, we have another copy of Fatal Push, 3 copies of Blessed Alliance to make them sacrifice an attacking creature, and hopefully later on game we can gain a little bit of life with it as well, and 2 Declaration in Stone, which is going to exile a target creature and all creatures its controller controls with the same name. Now, they're going to get a clue for this, but honestly, at this point, I think it's going to be worth it. We also have 4 copies of Gideon, Ally of Zendikar. To use him for his emblem to boost all of your creatures, to get +1/+1, or to pump out 2/2 White Knight tokens. In my eyes, Gideon is probably one of the best toolbox planeswalkers we have in Standard right now. Well, that's our deck tech. I hope you enjoyed it. I think this one is going to really stand out in the meta as we see it right now, that we have Mono Red is kind of doing its thing right now, making a comeback. I think this is a somewhat solid answer to that. And it's a little bit different too, and I am a big fan of tribals, so we have that going as well. Thank you very much for watching. It's greatly appreciated. If you happen to like this deck, leave us a comment down below. If you happen to play this deck, be sure to comment. Let us know what you thought, what you might change, and if you ended up playing like in an F&M or something with it, then let us know how you did. We would love to hear what this thing is doing out in the real world, aside from just us playing it. I'd like to thank Alex Blodgett for coming up with this deck list that we're doing the deck tech on today. Thank you very much for watching, and as always, you can find us on Facebook and Twitter, ChuckwagonMTG.